What happens when an alliance discovers that promises are far easier to manufacture than missiles? For more than 2 years, Ukraine has repeatedly asked its Western partners for one specific capability: not tanks, not fighter aircraft, not another package of financial assistance. Air defense. Because in modern warfare, protecting a city can become just as important as defending a front line. And yet, despite countless meetings, joint declarations, and public commitments, the gap between political support and military capability has become increasingly difficult to ignore. This is no longer simply a story about Ukraine. It is becoming a story about the limits of Europe's own defense system, because every intercepted missile represents something larger than a successful engagement. It represents years of industrial production, carefully managed inventories, trained personnel, and a supply chain that cannot be expanded overnight. That is the part most headlines rarely explain. Modern air defense is not built around launchers. It is built around ammunition. And ammunition, especially advanced interceptor missiles, is one of the most difficult military products to manufacture at scale. Every Patriot interceptor, every long-range defensive missile, contains sophisticated guidance systems, specialized electronics, precision components, and manufacturing processes that often require months, sometimes years, to complete. Once fired, they cannot simply be replaced next week. This changes the entire strategic equation, because every missile launched creates a new question, not whether it successfully intercepted its target, but whether another interceptor will be available tomorrow. That dilemma has quietly become one of the defining challenges of modern high-intensity warfare. Recent conflicts have demonstrated something many military planners understood in theory, but few expected to witness so quickly. Advanced missile stockpiles can disappear at an astonishing pace. Even nations, and some of the world's largest defense budgets, have discovered that sustained operations consume precision weapons far faster than factories can replenish them. The industrial age of warfare never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. Instead of producing thousands of artillery shells, modern defense industries must now produce thousands of highly sophisticated interceptors. The difficulty, however, is that these weapons cannot be mass-produced. Like conventional ammunition, every production line has physical limits. Factories require skilled engineers, specialized materials, long-term contracts, and perhaps most importantly, time. Time is exactly what Ukraine does not have. This is where Europe finds itself facing an uncomfortable reality. For decades, many European governments reduced military spending under the assumption that large-scale continental war had become increasingly unlikely. Resources shifted elsewhere. Infrastructure, healthcare, social programs, economic integration. The so-called peace dividend appeared to justify smaller military inventories and slower production capacity. For many years, that assumption seemed entirely reasonable. Then the strategic environment changed. Suddenly, countries discovered that rebuilding military capability is dramatically harder than reducing it. A factory that closes cannot immediately reopen. An experienced workforce cannot instantly reappear. Supply chains must be rebuilt, contracts negotiated, production expanded. Each of those steps requires years, not months. This is why recent announcements about increased defense spending deserve careful interpretation. Large budgets are important. Political commitments matter, but budgets do not immediately translate into operational capability. Announcing a new missile production program today does not place new interceptors inside launchers tomorrow. Industrial capacity operates on an entirely different timeline than political speeches. That distinction has become increasingly significant. Ukraine's requests are immediate. European responses are often long-term. Both positions are understandable, but they exist on different clocks, and those clocks are moving at very different speeds. The situation also exposes a broader question about modern alliances. Collective security works best when every member possesses meaningful capacity to contribute. Yet throughout much of the post-Cold War era, many European states continued relying on American military strength as the ultimate strategic guarantee. That arrangement was shaped by decades of shared geopolitical priorities. However, global priorities evolve, resources shift, new theaters emerge. Strategic attention cannot remain fixed forever, as Washington increasingly balances commitments across Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. European governments are being asked to assume greater responsibility for their own defense. In theory, most leaders agree with that objective. In practice, building an independent industrial base capable of sustaining high-Midas intensity conflict is among the most expensive and technically demanding projects any government can undertake. Factories cannot be built overnight. Engineers cannot be trained overnight. Missiles cannot be assembled overnight. And while those long Midas term investments continue, the immediate battlefield keeps moving. That is the dilemma facing Europe today. It is not simply a shortage of political will, nor is it merely a shortage of funding. It is, above all, a shortage of time. And in modern warfare, time may be the one resource that cannot be borrowed. Now comes the question that may shape the next phase of this war. If Europe understands the problem, why hasn't it solved it? The answer begins with something far less dramatic than missiles or battlefields. It begins inside factories. For decades, Europe's defense industry was designed for peacetime efficiency, not wartime endurance. Production lines remained active, but output stayed relatively small. Governments purchased equipment in limited batches. Manufacturers adjusted accordingly. Factories optimized for predictable demand, not emergency mobilization. That model worked. For Europe, that believed large scale war had become increasingly unlikely. But industrial capacity cannot suddenly multiply, because geopolitical conditions change. Building additional missile factories requires billions of dollars, highly specialized machinery, long Midas-term contracts, and an experienced workforce. Even after construction begins, production often takes years before reaching meaningful levels. That delay creates a dangerous window. The battlefield moves faster than industry, which means political leaders may recognize the threat, approve new budgets, announce ambitious programs, and still remain unable to change conditions. On today's battlefield, that is precisely the strategic gap Europe is now attempting to close. Britain illustrates this challenge particularly well. Since leaving the European Union, London has worked hard to redefine its role within European security. It has consistently positioned itself among Ukraine's strongest supporters, providing training, advanced weapons, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic leadership. Those decisions carry genuine strategic significance. But leadership does not automatically create inventory. Britain, like every European country, faces limits on how many advanced systems it can provide without affecting its own defense posture. The same calculation exists in Germany. Berlin has dramatically increased its defense spending over the past several years. New procurement programs are underway. Military modernization has become a national priority, yet rebuilding capability after decades of relatively modest investment is an enormous undertaking. Money accelerates progress. It does not eliminate time. France faces a slightly different equation. For decades, French military planning focused heavily on expeditionary operations, rapid deployments, and maintaining influence across Africa and the Mediterranean. Those capabilities remain valuable, but high Midas intensity, industrial scale warfare, demands something different. It demands large inventories, continuous production, and the ability to replace sophisticated equipment as quickly as it is consumed. That requirement is challenging for every Western defense industry, not just France. This brings us to the broader strategic picture. Ukraine's requests are not simply requests for additional weapons. They represent something much larger. Every new air-minus defense battery requires interceptors. Every interceptor fired must eventually be replaced. Every replacement depends upon an industrial system that was never designed for prolonged high-minus volume consumption. In other words, the real competition is no longer only between armies. It is increasingly between factories. Military historians have often argued that modern wars are decided not only by tactics, but by production. The side that sustains output longest usually gains the strategic advantage. That lesson appeared repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Today, it is returning in a different form. Instead of tanks, it involves precision-minus guided weapons. Instead of artillery shells alone, it includes interceptors, radars, electronics, and advanced sensors. Industrial resilience has once again become a strategic weapon. There is another factor receiving increasing attention. The United States has gradually shifted its strategic focus. Washington continues to support Ukraine, but American policymakers must now divide resources across multiple regions simultaneously. The Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, Europe posing each presents its own challenges, its own deterrence requirements, and its own military commitments. No nation, regardless of its power, possesses unlimited resources. Strategic prioritizations becomes unavoidable. That reality places additional pressure on European governments to assume greater responsibility for continental defense. Many leaders accept this publicly. The question is whether industrial capacity can expand quickly enough to match those political ambitions. For Ukraine, however, the timeline looks very different. Strategic planning for 2030 offers little comfort. Two cities requiring protection today. That contrast defines the central dilemma. Europe is preparing for the future. Ukraine is fighting in the present. Both objectives are legitimate, but they compete against the same limited inventory. So where does this leave a broader strategic picture? There are, broadly speaking, three possible paths forward. The first is gradual adaptation. European production expands, joint procurement increases, new missile factories enter service, and alliance capabilities steadily improve. This scenario requires patience, long-term political commitment, and continued financial investment. It is perhaps the most stable outcome, but also the slowest. The second possibility is accelerated mobilization. Faced with worsening security conditions, European governments could decide to treat defense production with far greater urgency, using emergency authorities, long-term industrial contracts, and coordinated procurement to dramatically increase output. History shows that democratic societies are capable of remarkable industrial expansion when political consensus exists. Whether that consensus emerges remains uncertain. The third possibility is that diplomatic developments change the strategic environment before industrial expansion fully materializes. Negotiations, ceasefires, or broader geopolitical shifts could reduce immediate demand for high-volume missile production. No serious analyst can confidently predict which path will ultimately prevail. Each depends upon decisions made far beyond the battlefield itself. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that this discussion is no longer only about Ukraine. It has become a test of Europe's ability to translate economic strength into military capability. For years, Europe demonstrated remarkable success as an economic project. The challenge today is different. Security requires not only wealth, but industrial endurance, strategic planning, and sustained political coordination. Those qualities cannot be improvised during a crisis. They must be built long before the crisis arrives. Perhaps that is the most important lesson emerging from this conflict. Modern alliances are measured not only by the promises their members make, but by the capabilities they can deliver. When those promises are tested in the coming months, watch carefully for signals that extend beyond daily battlefield reports. Watch defense production. Watch procurement contracts. Watch new manufacturing facilities. Watch how quickly European industry moves from announcement to delivery, because those developments may ultimately tell us far more about the future of European security than any single missile strike. Wars eventually end. Industrial transformation, however, often reshapes the international system for decades. The decisions being made today inside government ministries, defense companies, and manufacturing plants could influence the balance of power long after the current conflict has passed. That may prove to be the real story, not simply who possessed the stronger army, but who demonstrated the greater capacity to adapt, produce, and sustain modern warfare over the long term. And that is the question worth watching as this conflict enters its next chapter. I'll see you in the next one.